I adjusted the strap of my worn canvas bag and looked at my reflection in the cafe's window. My reflection stared back at me. Plain clothes, a simple gray dress, shoes that had seen better days, hair pulled into a low bun. I looked exactly how I wanted to look today. Ordinary, unremarkable, someone that nobody would assume had anything of value. It was a disguise I had worn before, though never for something quite like this. My name is Clara, and today I was meeting my daughter-in-law's family for the first time. But not as Clara, the successful architect with her own firm, not as the woman who built 3 schools and restored a historical museum, but as Clara, the widow of modest means who raised her son alone while working long hours in a local store. It wasn't a lie, not entirely. I had once been that woman. But life had changed. And so had my fortunes. Still, I wanted to see something for myself. How my daughter-in-law's family would treat someone they thought was beneath them. My son, Daniel, had tried to warn me. "Mom, please don't test them," he said over breakfast that morning, his brown eyes full of worry. "They're a bit traditional, yes, but Simone is nothing like them. She loves you, she really does." I smiled, sipping my coffee. "I believe you, son, but you know me. I like to understand people, to see them without their masks." He sighed. "You're impossible." "That's what your father used to say," I replied, with a soft smile. My husband had passed away a decade ago, leaving Daniel and me with memories and lessons about honesty and dignity. He used to say, "Money shows you who you are when you have it." I wanted to see who Simone's family truly were when they thought I didn't have any. The restaurant they had chosen was one of those elegant places where the waiters wore gloves and the menus didn't have prices. I arrived 10 minutes early and asked the hostess for a table under Simone's name. She led me through a room filled with glittering chandeliers and low murmurs of conversation. Every detail screamed wealth and exclusivity. I sat down and folded my hands on my lap, pretending to be slightly uncomfortable, the way someone might feel out of place among luxury. Simone arrived first, radiant as always, with her soft smile and polished appearance. "Mother-in-law," she greeted warmly, kissing me on both cheeks. "I'm so glad you came." "Of course, dear," I said with a gentle tone. "I wouldn't miss it." She was followed by her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Delacroix, and her younger sister, Valeria. Her father was tall, impeccably dressed in a navy suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Her mother wore diamonds that caught the light every time she moved. And her sister, well, she looked like she had stepped out of a fashion magazine. "Mrs. Clara, such a pleasure to finally meet you," Mr. Delacroix said, extending his hand. His grip was firm, his smile polite, but his eyes were already scanning me up and down, noting my simple clothes, my lack of jewelry, my modest purse. "The pleasure is mine," I replied calmly. Mrs. Delacroix leaned forward with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Simone has told us so much about you. You raised Daniel all on your own, right?" "That's so inspiring." The pause before inspiring told me exactly what she meant. "Yes," I said softly. "It wasn't easy, but we managed." Valeria smirked. "I can't imagine. My mom would go crazy without her morning spa visits. Right, Mom?" They laughed lightly. I smiled too, though my smile didn't reach my eyes either. The waiter arrived to take our order, and they all ordered wine. Something expensive, I was sure. I asked for water with lemon. Mrs. Delacroix tilted her head. "Not drinking, dear?" "No, thank you. I prefer to keep a clear head," I said simply. "Of course," she said, sipping her glass. "Some people just don't have the taste for fine things. Or maybe some people have different definitions of fine," I replied softly. Her smile faltered for just a second. The meal began with small talk. Simone telling stories from her and Daniel's honeymoon, Valeria complaining about her university professors, Mr. Delacroix discussing business. I listened more than I spoke, nodding occasionally. Then the questions began. "So, Clara," he said, "what do you do these days?" I gave a gentle laugh. "Oh, I still do some small projects here and there, mostly consulting, but nothing like the big firms." It wasn't a lie. I did consult, though small projects included designing a cultural center for the city government. "That's lovely," Mrs. Delacroix said. "It must be nice to keep busy at your age." "It is," I replied. "And what about you?" "We have a few companies," she said with a touch of pride. "Real estate, imports, investments, it's a full life." "I can imagine," I said politely. But her tone carried something else. A subtle need to remind me of my place, as if success only counted when measured in millions. The food arrived, beautiful plates that looked more like art than meals. I took a small bite, and as I did, I caught Mrs. Delacroix glancing at my hands. Bare, except for my wedding ring. "I admire simplicity," she said suddenly. "It's refreshing in a world obsessed with appearances." Her words might have sounded kind, but her tone carried a shadow of irony. "I agree," I said. "Simplicity is the highest form of elegance." Simone looked between us, sensing the tension. "Mom," she said to her mother, "you should try the salad. It's delicious." But Mrs. Delacroix wasn't done. "Simone tells me Daniel works in construction." "Yes," I replied. "He's an engineer. Very talented." "That's wonderful," she said. "Though I imagine it must have been difficult for him to get ahead without connections." "He built his own path," I said, my voice steady. "Hard work creates its own connections." "How admirable," Valeria murmured. "I could never survive like that. I need comfort." "Comfort is nice," I said, smiling faintly, "but peace of mind is better." Mr. Delacroix chuckled. "Well, peace doesn't pay the bills, does it?" "It depends on how expensive your peace is," I replied, keeping my tone light. There was silence for a few seconds. Simone reached for my hand under the table, squeezing it softly. I returned the squeeze, letting her know I was fine. The conversation shifted to vacations and luxury brands. They spoke of yachts, resorts, and investments abroad. I nodded occasionally, but inside I was observing, cataloging every detail. The way Mrs. Delacroix subtly looked down on the waiter, how Valeria's laughter always had an edge, how Mr. Delacroix talked more about profit than purpose. By the time dessert arrived, I had already seen enough. Still, I played my role, humble, polite, a bit naive. When the bill came, Mr. Delacroix reached for it, then paused dramatically. No, I said softly. "Please, let me contribute." He chuckled. "That's kind, but don't worry about it. It's a bit steep." "I insist," I said, pulling out my small purse. I could feel their discomfort immediately. Mrs. Delacroix laughed softly. "Really, dear, it's fine. Consider it a gift." "Thank you," I said, placing my small bills on the tray anyway. Their eyes widened slightly. That was when I knew I had struck a nerve. They saw me as something small, something to pity. And that was exactly what I needed them to think, for now. Because the night was far from over. When I stepped out of the restaurant, the evening air felt like freedom against my skin. I smiled faintly as I walked toward the parking lot, clutching my old canvas bag. I could feel their gazes still lingering in my mind, that mix of politeness and quiet judgment. They saw a woman who didn't belong in their world, someone who lived modestly, perhaps too modestly for their liking. But what they didn't know was that I owned one of the buildings they probably did business in. My car was parked a little farther down the street, an old sedan that looked perfectly at home in my current disguise. I unlocked it and then sat for a moment, breathing in, thinking of Daniel. He had been so anxious about this dinner. But I needed to see what kind of family my son had married into. I had no intentions of interfering. I just wanted to know if Simone would be safe in their hands, or if their wealth and pride would one day turn into chains around her neck. The following weekend, Simone invited me to their family home for lunch. "Mom, please don't bring anything fancy," she said over the phone. "Just come as you are." I chuckled softly. "Don't worry, dear, I'll come exactly as I am." She didn't know what I meant by that, but I did. When I arrived at their mansion, and mansion was the only word for it, I was greeted by a large iron gate that opened after a long moment of camera scanning. A gardener gave me a quick glance as I stepped out of my car, and I could see the faintest flicker of surprise in his eyes. Maybe he expected someone more polished to visit the Delacroix estate. The house itself stood tall and proud, with marble columns and huge windows that reflected the sunlight like mirrors. A fountain sparkled in the front yard, its water dancing gracefully. I smiled to myself. It was beautiful, yes, but beauty doesn't always mean warmth. Simone came running out to greet me, wearing a simple dress this time, her hair tied up in a ponytail. "Mother," she said, wrapping her arms around me. Her genuine affection was like a balm to my heart. "I'm so glad you came." "Of course, sweetheart," I said, hugging her back. "You look lovely." "Thank you," she said, leading me inside. "Everyone's already in the garden." Inside, the house was as elegant as one would expect. Expensive art, imported furniture, a chandelier that must have cost a fortune. But there was something else too, something colder. It was too perfect, too arranged, as if no one really lived there, only performed the idea of a perfect family. When we stepped into the garden, the rest of the family was seated under a wide umbrella near the pool. Mrs. Delacroix was wearing a sun hat, her posture straight, her expression as composed as ever. Mr. Delacroix was reading something on his tablet, and Valeria was sprawled on a lounge chair, scrolling through her phone. "Ah, Mrs. Clara," Mr. Delacroix said, standing as I approached. "So good of you to join us." "Thank you for having me," I said, offering a polite smile. "It's a beautiful home you have." "We do our best," Mrs. Delacroix said, waving her hand modestly, though her eyes gleamed with pride. "Please, have a seat." I sat at the table, feeling the warmth of the sun on my back. A maid appeared with a tray of drinks. "Lemonade, please," I said when she asked. Mrs. Delacroix raised a brow. "No wine again?" "No, thank you," I said softly. "It makes me sleepy." "How quaint," Valeria muttered. I pretended not to hear her. Lunch was served shortly after, an elegant spread of salads, roasted fish, and pastries. The smell was wonderful. I complimented the cook, which seemed to catch them off guard. "You mean our chef," Mrs. Delacroix corrected gently, her lips twitching with faint amusement. "We don't cook ourselves." "Of course," I said with a nod, "though there's something special about food made with your own hands." "That's what help is for," she replied with a delicate laugh. I smiled, even as I felt a twinge of sadness. People like her rarely understood the joy of creating, of building something from scratch, whether it was a meal, a home, or a life. As we ate, Mr. Delacroix turned to me. "Simone tells me you used to live on the east side, near the old station?" "Yes," I said, "for many years." "That's quite an area," he said. "A bit rough, if I recall." "It builds character," I said, and his smile froze for a moment. Mrs. Delacroix dabbed her lips with her napkin. "And now? Do you still live there?" "I moved a while ago," I said, "but I visit sometimes. It keeps me grounded." Valeria laughed lightly. "I can't imagine going back to a place like that. I'd feel dirty just walking down the street." Simone gave her sister a sharp look. "Valeria," she said, "that's rude." "It's fine," I said calmly. "We all have places we feel at home in. For me, that's wherever I can be myself." Mrs. Delacroix smiled tightly. "Of course. Still, I imagine you must be proud. Raising such a successful son on your own must have been challenging." "It was," I said, my voice gentle but steady. "But Daniel was always determined. He wanted to make something of himself. And he did." "Yes," Mr. Delacroix said. "A construction engineer, right? It's good work. Honest, if not very lucrative." I tilted my head slightly. "Success isn't always measured by numbers, Mr. Delacroix. Sometimes it's measured by the lives you touch." He chuckled. "You sound like a philosopher, Mrs. Clara." "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe just someone who's lived long enough to know what matters." There was a short silence before Simone spoke again, trying to lighten the mood. "Mom, Dad, Clara's son just finished the city's new bridge project. It's been in the papers." Mr. Delacroix nodded. "Ah, yes, I saw something about that. Impressive." He didn't sound impressed, more like he was conceding a point. Mrs. Delacroix leaned back. "So, Clara, tell us, do you plan to retire soon?" "I suppose I could," I said, "but I like keeping busy. There's a community center I'm helping design. Small project, but it means a lot to the people there." "Community work," she said, smiling faintly. "That's sweet." Her tone made the word sweet sound like insignificant. "It is," I said. "People need spaces that remind them they belong somewhere." Valeria rolled her eyes. "Sounds boring." "It's not for everyone," I said simply. I could see Simone's discomfort growing. She wanted her family to like me, but she didn't know that I wasn't looking for their approval. I was looking for their truth, and I had already found enough to see it clearly. After lunch, Mrs. Delacroix invited me for tea inside. I followed her to a room that looked more like an art gallery than a living space. She gestured toward a velvet chair. "You know, Clara," she began, stirring her tea slowly, "you seem like a kind woman. I just worry a little about differences." "Differences?" I asked softly. "Between our families," she said. "Socially, economically, culturally. You understand." "Of course," I said, smiling. "But love doesn't check bank accounts before it blooms." "Perhaps," she said. "But marriage is more than love. It's merging two worlds, and sometimes one world doesn't quite fit into the other." I met her gaze calmly. "I've built bridges before," I said. "They connect worlds." For the first time, her composure cracked, just slightly. A small frown flickered across her lips, as if she didn't know whether to take my words as wisdom or defiance. "Well," she said finally, "time will tell." "It always does," I said softly. But what she didn't know was that time had already told me everything I needed to know about her. The next few weeks passed in a blur of polite invitations and forced smiles. Simone was doing her best to keep everyone happy, Daniel, her parents, and me. I could see how much she loved Daniel, and for that alone, I stayed patient. Every time we met, Mrs. Delacroix would drop little comments that sounded kind on the surface but stung beneath. "You have such a simple charm, Clara," she'd say. Or, "I envy your ability to live without worrying about appearances." It was like she couldn't help reminding me of the place she thought I belonged. One afternoon, Simone called me excitedly. "Mom, we're hosting a small family dinner next Saturday. My parents will be there, and I was hoping you could join. It'll be a chance for everyone to spend time together before Daniel's promotion ceremony." I smiled at the thought of Daniel's promotion. He had worked so hard for it. "Of course, dear," I said. "I'll be there." "Oh, and Mom," she added hesitantly, "please don't stress about bringing anything. Just come as you always do." "I'll bring a small dessert," I said. "It's nothing fancy." She hesitated for a second, then said, "That would be perfect." What she didn't know was that I intended to bring more than dessert. I wanted to see how the Delacroix family behaved when their comfort was challenged, even slightly. On the day of the dinner, I wore the same gray dress from our first meeting. I pinned my hair simply, put on my old cardigan, and carried a small basket with a covered dish. When I arrived, the house was buzzing with activity. A few of Mr. Delacroix's business associates were there, and I recognized one or two from charity galas, men who would never have guessed that the poor woman in front of them had once signed off on city contracts they tried and failed to win. Simone greeted me warmly, kissing my cheek. "You look lovely, Mom." "Thank you, dear," I said. "You always say that." "Because it's always true." Her sincerity softened me a little. I followed her into the dining room, where the table was set beautifully with silverware that gleamed under the chandelier. Mrs. Delacroix was arranging flowers in the center of the table. When she saw me, her smile returned, polite and distant. "Clara," she said, "how nice to see you again." "Thank you for inviting me," I said, placing the basket on the counter. "I brought a small dessert. It's an old recipe from my mother." "How quaint," she said, glancing briefly at the basket. "I hope you don't mind if we add it to the end of the meal." "Of course not," I replied. During dinner, conversation flowed easily, at least between the Delacroix family and their guests. They spoke of investments, travel, and art, while I listened quietly. Every now and then, someone would ask me a polite question, the kind that didn't need an answer. "So, Mrs. Clara," one of the guests said, "what do you do in your free time?" I read," I said, "and sometimes I visit sites under construction. I like to see how things are built." "Ah," he said with mild surprise, "so you're interested in architecture?" "Very much so," I replied. "I always find it fascinating how a design on paper becomes something you can walk through." Mr. Delacroix chuckled. "Well, it's certainly not as glamorous as people think. You wouldn't believe how many small firms struggle just to stay afloat." I smiled faintly. "Yes, I can imagine, though sometimes the small firms end up teaching the bigger ones a few lessons." He looked at me with curiosity, perhaps unsure if I meant anything by it. The evening wore on, and after dessert was served, my simple caramel flan, which Simone loved, the conversation took a turn. Mrs. Delacroix leaned forward, her tone dripping with mock concern. "Clara, forgive me for being so direct, but don't you ever feel out of place around, well, people like us?" I looked at her for a long moment, pretending to ponder. "Why would I?" I asked softly. "Because of wealth." She blinked. "Not just that," she said quickly. "I mean, our families are so different. I'm sure it must feel strange sometimes." "It doesn't," I said calmly. "I've met all kinds of people, some rich, some poor. It's funny how the amount of money never really changes who they are, just what they reveal." "What they reveal," she repeated with a faint laugh. "Yes," I said, meeting her gaze evenly. "Money is like a light. It doesn't change the shape of what it shines on. It just makes it visible." For a moment, the table went quiet. Then Valeria giggled. "You sound like one of those wise old ladies from a movie," I smiled. "Maybe I've watched too many movies." Simone was looking at me with a mix of admiration and concern, while Daniel looked proud but wary, as if he feared I might say something that would spark a storm. After dinner, when most of the guests were gone, Mrs. Delacroix approached me privately. "You're very philosophical, Clara," she said. "I suppose hardship teaches that kind of perspective." "It does," I agreed, "but so does success." "Of course," she said smoothly, "though forgive me for saying success can mean very different things for different people." "Yes," I said with a small smile. "For some, it's a title. For others, it's peace." "And for you?" she asked. "For me," I said, "success is when people underestimate you, and you let them." She laughed softly. But I could tell she didn't quite understand. As I turned to leave, she added, "You know, Clara, if you ever need anything, financially or otherwise, please don't hesitate to ask. Family should help family." I turned back to her, keeping my smile gentle. "That's kind of you," I said. But I'm doing quite well. I always have. Her expression flickered, a shadow of confusion crossing her face. Maybe she expected me to show gratitude or embarrassment. Instead, I just stood there, calm and steady, until she excused herself. Later that night, as I drove home, I thought about how easy it was for people like the Delacroix to mistake humility for weakness. They believed they held the upper hand simply because they had money, influence, and a name that opened doors. What they didn't realize was that I owned some of those doors. The land under their favorite restaurant? Mine. The small architectural firm that renovated their holiday home last year? Mine too, under a different name. I had built my success quietly, preferring privacy to pride. My late husband and I had agreed long ago that real strength was knowing you didn't need to prove yourself. But tonight, for the first time, I felt the faint pull of something else, an urge to teach them what respect truly meant, not with anger or confrontation, but with truth. They would learn it soon enough. Because Simone and Daniel's wedding anniversary was coming up, and I had an idea that would reveal everything without me saying a word. The idea came to me quietly one evening as I sat on my balcony, sipping tea and watching the city lights blink like stars. I thought about all the little humiliations I had endured with polite smiles, all the subtle jabs masked as concern, and I realized I didn't want revenge. I wanted understanding. I wanted them to see me, not the version they had decided I was. When Simone called a few days later to invite me to their anniversary dinner, I knew it was the right opportunity. "It's going to be something small," she said. "Just family and a few close friends. We'll have it at that new restaurant on Oak Street. My parents offered to make the reservations." "Of course they did," I said with a small laugh. "What should I wear?" "Whatever makes you comfortable, Mom," she said gently, though I could hear the nervousness in her voice. "You know how my mother can be. But don't worry. Daniel and I will be with you the whole time." "I'm not worried," I said. "It'll be a lovely evening." When the day arrived, I dressed much the same as before. Plain skirt, soft blouse, no jewelry except my wedding ring, but this time I carried a small envelope in my purse, a simple piece of paper inside, one that would quietly change the tone of the night. The restaurant was beautiful. Warm lighting, elegant tables, a wall of glass overlooking the city. I arrived a few minutes early, and the hostess guided me to the private room where the family had gathered. Mrs. Delacroix was already there, radiant in a silk dress, her diamonds catching the light like tiny suns. "Clara," she said warmly, kissing the air near my cheek, "how lovely of you to join us." "Thank you for inviting me," I said, handing her a small wrapped box. "A little something for the happy couple." "You didn't need to bring anything," she said, though her eyes flicked to the box with curiosity. "It's just tradition," I said. Simone came over and hugged me tightly. "Mom, I'm so glad you're here." Daniel joined us, smiling proudly. "It means a lot, Mom. You've always been there for us." "Always will be," I said softly. Dinner began smoothly. The wine flowed, laughter filled the room, and for a moment it almost felt like a real family celebration. But then the conversation turned. "Simone tells me you still live in the same apartment," Mrs. Delacroix said, dabbing delicately at her lips. "Isn't it small for you, especially now that your son is married and successful?" "It's just right for me," I replied. "I've never liked big houses. Too much space makes me feel lonely." "Of course," she said with a hint of pity. "But if you ever want to upgrade, I know a few good agents. We could find you something comfortable, perhaps closer to us." "That's very kind," I said, "but I'm comfortable where I am. It's just that," she continued, "appearances do matter, don't they? People might think, well, I suppose it's none of my business." I smiled gently. "You're right, it isn't." Her expression faltered, and I saw Daniel glance at me with quiet pride. He had grown stronger lately, more assertive. I liked to think my example had something to do with that. "Mother," Simone said, trying to ease the tension, "Mom's place is cozy and beautiful. She doesn't need a big house to prove anything." "Oh, darling," her mother said with a light laugh. "I didn't mean it that way. I just think everyone deserves to enjoy the fruits of life. Some of us already are," I said softly. "Just differently." The waiter arrived to serve the next course, and the conversation shifted, but I could feel the discomfort lingering like perfume in the air. As dessert approached, I excused myself and stepped out briefly, asking the hostess for a favor. She nodded, understanding immediately. She had seen my name when I made the special arrangement earlier in the week. When I returned to the table, Mrs. Delacroix was telling one of her endless stories about their family vacation in Monaco. "It was divine," she said. "We stayed at the Hotel de Paris, right next to the casino. Franklin played poker with a few CEOs. Oh, the stories I could tell. It sounds wonderful, I said with an amused tone. I suppose you enjoy that lifestyle. Of course, she said proudly. Who wouldn't? It's the reward for hard work and ambition. Yes, I said. Or sometimes for being married to someone ambitious. She stiffened, but smiled thinly. Touché. A moment later, the restaurant manager entered the room with the bill on a silver tray. He handed it to Mr. Delacroix, who barely glanced at it before waving his hand. Put it on my card. The manager hesitated. I'm sorry, sir, but the bill has already been settled. Settled? Franklin repeated. By whom? The manager looked in my direction. By the owner. The owner, Mrs. Delacroix said with surprise. That's odd. We don't know the owner. Actually, I said calmly, sipping my water. You do. They all turned to me. I own this restaurant, I said simply. The silence that followed was thick enough to touch. You? Mrs. Delacroix said finally, half laughing. You must be joking. Not at all, I replied, taking out the small envelope from my purse. I started the chain 5 years ago. It was a project I worked on quietly after my husband passed. This particular location opened last year. I thought it fitting to celebrate here. She blinked rapidly, trying to process the words. But why would you? Because I wanted to, I said, still calm. Because I love good food, and because I believe in building things that last. You mean you're wealthy? Valeria said, incredulous. Comfortable, I corrected. Wealth is relative. But yes, I suppose you could say I'm not in need of real estate advice. Simone's eyes were wide, but not with shock, more with realization. Mom, she whispered, you never told us. You never asked, I said gently, and it never mattered. Mrs. Delacroix's face was pale now, her mouth opening and closing without sound. Why pretend? She asked finally. Why act poor? Because I wanted to know who you were when you thought I had nothing to offer, I said. And now I do. The waiter returned with the wrapped gift box I had brought earlier. I slid it toward Simone and Daniel. This, I said, is your anniversary gift. Simone opened it carefully. Inside was a set of property keys and a small folded document. Her eyes widened. Mom, this is the deed to a house, I said. A wedding gift I planned long ago but waited for the right moment to give. It's in your names now. Daniel was speechless. Mom, I can't accept this. Yes, you can, I interrupted, because it's not about money. It's about roots, a home where your family can grow without fear, without pressure, I turned to the Delacroix. And it's proof that sometimes those you look down on stand taller than you think. Mrs. Delacroix said nothing, her diamond bracelet trembling slightly as she lifted her glass. To family, I said softly, raising mine. The real kind. The silence that followed my toast was thick, fragile, and almost beautiful in its discomfort. Simone's hands trembled slightly as she held the document, her eyes darting between me and her parents. Daniel leaned back in his chair, visibly stunned, his expression a mix of pride, awe, and quiet vindication. For a few moments, no one spoke. The only sound was the faint clinking of cutlery and the whisper of soft jazz playing through the restaurant speakers. Finally, Mrs. Delacroix found her voice. Well, she said, her tone struggling to find balance between composure and disbelief, this is quite a surprise. It wasn't meant to be a spectacle, I said gently. Only a reminder that appearances can be deceiving. Her husband cleared his throat. You've certainly made your point. I turned to him. I didn't come to make a point, Mr. Delacroix. I came to meet my family, to know who my daughter-in-law's parents truly were. The rest revealed itself. You made us feel like fools, Mrs. Delacroix said, her voice sharp now, though her eyes shone with something closer to wounded pride than anger. You sat there, letting us believe you were poor, I offered softly. Humble? Less, she snapped. You let us look down on you. No, I said. You chose to look down on me. I simply allowed you the space to show who you were. There was no malice in my voice, no triumph, just truth. That somehow made it sting more. Simone reached for my hand. Mom, I'm so sorry. I had no idea about any of this. There's nothing to apologize for, I said, squeezing her fingers. You love Daniel, and that's what matters. Everything else was just noise. You could have told us, Daniel said quietly, though there was no accusation in his tone, just curiosity. Why didn't you? Because wealth changes people, I said. It makes them behave differently, even if they don't realize it. I didn't want anyone, especially Simone's family, to treat me differently just because of what I have. I wanted to see if kindness lived here without condition. I looked at Mrs. Delacroix when I said it. Her face softened, but only slightly. And what did you see? She asked. I saw a woman who values her family deeply but sometimes confuses dignity with status. I saw a man who measures success in profit rather than peace. And I saw a young woman, I added, glancing at Valeria, who hasn't yet decided which of those two paths she'll follow. Valeria shifted uncomfortably, crossing her arms. "Maybe people just like nice things," she muttered. "There's nothing wrong with that." "Of course not," I said. "But when nice things become the measure of a person's worth, you start to lose sight of what's truly valuable." The room fell quiet again. Then Simone stood up, her voice trembling. "I think Mom's right," she said. "We've all been living behind masks. Me too, maybe. Trying to fit into a world that judges people by the size of their wallet. But the only thing that's ever mattered to Daniel and me is the kind of life we build together." Daniel rose beside her, his arm slipping around her waist. "We don't want our family to be divided by pride," he said firmly. "If we're going to raise children someday, I want them to learn humility and kindness before anything else." His words hung in the air, cutting through the last of the tension. Mrs. Delacroix looked down, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. Then, almost reluctantly, she said, "Perhaps we've been unkind. I didn't mean to be cruel, Clara. Well, you must understand, our world is built on perception. Appearances matter." "They do," I agreed, "but not nearly as much as you think. Appearances fade, character remains." She nodded slowly, her eyes glistening. "I suppose I've forgotten that." "It's easy to forget," I said softly. "The world rewards arrogance louder than it praises decency." Mr. Delacroix stood then, adjusting his jacket as if to reassert a sense of control. "You've given us a great deal to think about, Mrs. Clara," he said formally, "and perhaps a much-needed lesson." "Lessons only matter if we learn from them," I replied. "Otherwise, they're just stories we tell to make ourselves feel wiser." He gave a small, almost respectful nod. Valeria, surprisingly, was the first to break the remaining tension. "So," she said hesitantly, "does this mean I should stop calling you sweet old Clara when I talk about you to my friends?" I smiled. "You can call me whatever you like, dear, but I think sweet old Clara might not fit quite as well anymore." Simone laughed softly, the first genuine sound of warmth that evening. "I think Mom suits you best." "I agree," Daniel added, grinning. The mood began to lighten after that. The waiter brought fresh tea and coffee, and the conversation slowly shifted away from confrontation to something more human. Stories, memories, laughter. I told them about the early days of my business, about the mistakes and the nights I thought I'd lose everything. Simone's parents listened, truly listened for the first time. When the evening ended, I stood by the door as they prepared to leave. Mrs. Delacroix approached me, hesitation in her every step. "Clara," she said quietly, "I misjudged you. I can admit that. I hope we can start again." I smiled gently. "That's all I ever wanted." She extended her hand, but instead of shaking it, I took it between mine. "Let's start by being honest, with each other and ourselves." "I'd like that," she said softly. Her husband nodded, a little stiffly, but his tone carried sincerity. "You've earned my respect, Mrs. Clara." "I didn't need to earn it," I said kindly. "You just needed to see why I deserved it." As they left, Simone and Daniel stayed behind for a moment. Simone hugged me tightly, whispering, "You've changed everything tonight." "Maybe," I said, "or maybe I just reminded everyone what really matters." When I finally walked out into the cool night air, I felt a deep calm settle in my chest. The city lights glimmered around me, reflections dancing on the restaurant's glass facade. Somewhere behind those lights, people would continue to measure themselves by what they owned. But I had no need for that anymore. I had built something stronger: truth, respect, and family. And as I got into my car, the faintest smile touched my lips because I knew the story wasn't over yet. There was still one more truth to reveal, one that none of them saw coming. The weeks following that evening unfolded quietly, like a soft breeze after a storm. There was no grand confrontation, no lingering bitterness, only the slow, deliberate rebuilding of something fragile yet genuine. Simone called me more often, sometimes just to talk about simple things, recipes, books, little moments with Daniel. Her tone had changed. There was a tenderness in her voice that hadn't been there before, as if she finally saw me not as an obligation or a symbol of modesty, but as a person, layered and complex. Daniel, too, seemed lighter. He told me one afternoon over coffee that he'd been offered a senior position at his company. "It's funny," he said, stirring his cup. "All those years, I kept thinking I had to prove myself. To them, to you, to everyone. But now I realize the only person I ever needed to make proud was myself." You've always made me proud, I said quietly. I just wanted you to know who you were, not what the world told you to be. He smiled, eyes soft with gratitude. You have a strange way of teaching lessons, Mom. So I've been told. Life began to settle into a rhythm again. But one afternoon, about a month later, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. When I answered, it was Mrs. Delacroix. Her voice was softer, quieter than I'd ever heard it. Clara, I hope I'm not intruding, she said. Not at all, I replied. How are you? Reflective, she admitted. I was wondering, would you join me for tea? Just the two of us? There was a pause before I answered. I'd like that. We met at a little cafe in the city, a modest place. The kind of spot I frequented often, but she had probably never noticed before. When she arrived, she wasn't dressed in her usual finery. No diamonds, no silk scarf, just a simple cream blouse and trousers. She even carried her own bag. You look lovely, I said as she sat down. So do you, she replied with a small smile. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she sighed, folding her hands in front of her. I've been thinking a lot about what you said that night. About money, appearances, character. I suppose I spent most of my life chasing things that never filled me the way I thought they would. We all chase something, I said. The trick is realizing when to stop running. I wish I'd realized it sooner, she murmured. You see, when Simone married Daniel, I worried she was marrying below her station. I thought I was protecting her. But I was really protecting my ego. You showed me that, though I doubt you meant to. I did, I admitted, but not to hurt you. I just wanted the truth to breathe a little. She looked up, eyes glistening. I respect you, Clara. Truly. And I'd like us to start again if that's still possible, I smiled gently. It always was. We spent the rest of the afternoon talking, not as rivals or in-laws, but as women who had lived enough to understand the weight of their own mistakes. She told me about her youth, her fears, the loneliness that sometimes crept in despite her luxurious surroundings. I told her about my years building the business, the heartbreak of losing my husband, and the quiet pride of raising Daniel alone. When we parted, she hugged me, a genuine embrace, not the polite kind she used to offer. Thank you, she whispered. For everything. Take care of your family, I said softly. They need you. As I walked away, I realized that forgiveness often came dressed in humility, and that was something no amount of wealth could buy. Months passed. Daniel and Simone moved into the house I'd given them, a beautiful home surrounded by trees, full of laughter and light. They hosted small gatherings now, the kind where everyone helped in the kitchen, where shoes were kicked off and stories filled the air. Sometimes the Delacroix came too. They were different, gentler, more present. I saw Mrs. Delacroix playing with her granddaughter one sunny afternoon, her laughter ringing through the garden, and I thought, people really can change when given the chance. One evening, Daniel invited me to a dinner at their home. No surprises this time, Mom, he teased. Just family. When I arrived, the smell of roasted herbs and baked bread filled the air. Simone hugged me tightly, leading me to the table. There were no crystal chandeliers, no gold-plated cutlery, just warmth, simplicity, and love. Mrs. Delacroix raised her glass as we all sat down. To new beginnings, she said, her voice steady, and to the lessons we didn't know we needed. We clinked glasses, and I couldn't help but smile. As the evening went on, laughter filled the room. We talked about old memories, about travels, about dreams yet to come. When dessert came out, a caramel flan, my old recipe, I felt tears sting my eyes. You remembered, I said to Simone. Of course, she replied, smiling. It's your tradition now. Later that night, after everyone had gone, I stood by the window, watching the lights of their home glow softly against the dark sky. Daniel came up beside me and put an arm around my shoulder. You know, Mom, he said, if you hadn't done what you did, we might never have seen who people truly were. And now, I asked? Now, he said, smiling, we see clearly. As I drove home, I thought about how strange life was, how it tested you, how it disguised blessings as conflicts, and how truth always found its way through, no matter how deeply buried. I pulled into my driveway, turned off the engine, and sat there for a moment, surrounded by silence. My husband's old watch gleamed faintly on my wrist. I touched it and whispered, You were right. Money doesn't change who we are, it just shows who we've always been. The night was still, the stars high and clear above. I went inside, lit a single lamp, and poured myself a cup of tea. Tomorrow would come, as it always did, full of small miracles and quiet lessons. I had no need for grandeur anymore. I had my peace, my family, and the knowledge that truth, once revealed, had the power to heal even the deepest divides, and as I sat there, smiling to myself, I knew that somewhere, in the echo of that first dinner long ago, a poor and naive mother had finally taught the world a lesson it would never forget. If you were touched by this story, don't forget to share it and let others feel its warmth too, because sometimes the most powerful truths come from the humblest hearts.